My boss leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "I could punish you, or reward you." And just like that, everything between us shifted. The first day it happened, nothing extraordinary was supposed to occur. I was at my desk, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of papers, immersed in the monotony of spreadsheets and emails. But then she appeared, my boss. She moved through the office with the kind of quiet confidence that made the air feel different, warmer somehow, even when she didn't speak. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that made age seem irrelevant. Her dark hair framed her face softly, and her posture carried authority without arrogance. Even the light touch of her perfume left a lingering warmth as she passed by my desk, a subtle, almost imperceptible scent that I would remember long after the moment had passed. I tried to focus on the screen in front of me, pretending not to notice her presence. But then she leaned slightly over my shoulder to glance at my work. Just for a second, our fingers almost brushed as she adjusted a paper. It was accidental, I'm sure, but the sensation sent a ripple of awareness through me. My pulse quickened, though my mind insisted it was just nerves. Her eyes lingered on mine for a fraction longer than professional etiquette would suggest, a curious spark dancing in their depths. In that brief contact, the world outside that tiny shared space seemed to fall away. Everything was reduced to the quiet thrum of her presence and the strange, magnetic pull it exerted on me. She smiled then, just a small curve of her lips, and moved back to her own desk. It was casual, as if nothing had happened, but I felt the lingering weight of that moment, like the soft warmth of sunlight pressing against my skin after a cold morning. I couldn't tell if she had noticed the way I'd almost leaned forward, or if she had, whether she'd felt the same unspoken tension. Something about her presence demanded awareness, attention, and yet, it was subtle, respectful. Nothing forced, nothing overt, just, charged. Even the mundane sounds of the office, the tapping of keyboards, the distant hum of printers, seemed to fade into the background. I found myself acutely aware of small details, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she settled into her chair, the way her hair caught the light, the soft intonation of her voice when she spoke to colleagues. It was strange, unsettling even, to feel drawn in by someone so far removed from my own life experience, yet so impossibly close in these fleeting interactions. By the end of that day, I realized I was waiting for the next accidental brush of hands, the next fleeting glance. I didn't know if it was curiosity, admiration, or something more dangerous, more magnetic, but I knew one thing: the rhythm of the office had changed, and I couldn't ignore it. It was a quiet afternoon in the office, the kind where time seems to stretch, leaving a soft hum of concentration in its wake. I was focused on a stack of reports, carefully checking figures, when she appeared at my desk again. There was an ease to her movements, like she belonged everywhere at once yet remained singular in presence. I had noticed it the first day, but today, there was something different, a subtle closeness in the way she leaned over my shoulder, her body brushing mine ever so slightly, that made the air feel heavier. Her hand hovered briefly over the papers I was reviewing, fingers lightly grazing the edge of mine as she pointed to a minor correction. It was accidental, of course, yet in that moment, I became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the softness of her touch against my skin. The office noises faded, reduced to a background murmur, leaving only the sound of her voice, quiet and deliberate, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath brushing my ear. "I could punish you for this, or reward you," she whispered, her tone teasing, but balanced with a professional restraint that kept the words safe, yet utterly charged. My heart skipped a beat, and I had to remind myself to keep breathing. The sentence was so perfectly ambiguous, leaving me suspended between curiosity and hesitation. Was it a joke? A challenge? Or something more subtle that I couldn't yet name? The brief contact lingered in my senses, her hand retreating slowly, her eyes meeting mine for just a fraction longer than necessary. In that gaze, there was a flicker of something unspoken, awareness, amusement, perhaps even a quiet acknowledgement that she recognized the tension simmering between us. It wasn't bold, it wasn't reckless, it was a careful, precise hint, an invitation to notice, to wonder, to feel something that neither of us could yet name out loud. As she straightened and returned to her own desk, the soft click of her heels seemed to echo in my chest, the whisper of her words replaying over and over. My mind churned with possibilities, with questions I wasn't sure I should ask, and yet couldn't stop asking. Every glance afterward, every small proximity, carried that tiny spark of unspoken intrigue, making even routine tasks feel charged with potential. I tried to focus back on the spreadsheets in front of me, but my hands were suddenly aware of the space she had occupied, the warmth that seemed to linger in the air. Her presence, her closeness, her words, they weren't overt, but they were enough to leave an impression that refused to fade. And I realized, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just professional admiration, it was the beginning of something more, delicate and precarious, quietly igniting between us. The days that followed were filled with an almost unbearable subtlety. The office routine continued, but the rhythm between us had shifted. Every shared moment, every accidental proximity, carried weight. It wasn't overt or reckless, yet I felt it, an invisible current running between us, threading through the ordinary, transforming even the smallest interactions into something meaningful. Passing in the hallway became a quiet game of awareness. Our eyes would meet for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and then we'd both look away, pretending to be absorbed in our own work. Yet, in that brief, silent connection, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. It was in the way her gaze would follow me across the room, lingering just at the edge of what felt permissible, and in the subtle way her posture relaxed when our paths crossed. It was a silent conversation of unspoken thoughts and restrained desire. At my desk, she would occasionally hand me a folder, and our fingers would brush ever so slightly. The touch was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it left a warmth that lingered far longer than it should. My pulse would quicken, and I'd feel a strange mixture of alarm and longing, trying to reconcile my professional respect for her with the undeniable draw of her presence. Even the mundane, the tap of her pen on a notepad, the subtle hum of her voice during a phone call, seemed heightened, charged with an intimacy I wasn't supposed to feel. There were moments when our work brought us together at the same table, leaning over reports or brainstorming projects. The closeness felt natural, yet electric. I noticed the small things, the way her hair caught the light as she leaned forward, the soft scent that accompanied her movements, the quiet steadiness of her hands as they rested near mine. Every detail etched itself into my awareness, leaving me restless and aware of a tension that was growing, unspoken but undeniable. One afternoon, I caught her watching me from across the room. She wasn't staring, exactly, her gaze was careful, fleeting, but the brief moment left me unsettled in the best possible way. I realized I wasn't the only one feeling this pull, she noticed, just as much as I did, and perhaps it intrigued her as it did me. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The office, once a place of routine and quiet diligence, had become charged with potential. Every glance, every brush of hands, every soft smile seemed to carry an invitation, a suggestion of something more, just out of reach. And I knew, without either of us speaking a word, that this slow, careful tension was only just beginning. The rhythm of the office had settled into a quiet tension, a careful dance of glances and fleeting touches. But one evening, everything shifted in the gentlest, most unexpected way. I stayed late, finishing a report under the dim glow of my desk lamp, when I noticed her still at her office across the room. She seemed different, somehow softer. The usual confident, composed demeanor was there, but now it was tinged with a subtle weariness, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Curiosity, and concern, pulled me across the room, and she looked up as I approached. Her eyes carried a hint of surprise, but there was no judgment, only a quiet openness. I realized, in that moment, that beneath the layers of professionalism, she was human, with worries and pressures just like anyone else. Her voice, usually steady and assured, softened as she spoke about a challenging project, her tone tinged with frustration but not defeat. She didn't need me to solve anything, she just needed someone to listen, and instinctively, I wanted to be that person. As we talked, our distance seemed to shrink. I noticed how her hands moved, nervous, almost delicate gestures I had never seen in the controlled environment of the office. The warmth radiating from her as she leaned slightly toward me made the air feel heavier, more intimate. At one point, her hand brushed mine briefly, a comforting gesture so subtle it could have been accidental, yet it carried a weight that lingered in my chest long after. I felt the quiet steadiness of her trust in that moment, and it drew me in, deeper than any glance or teasing whisper ever had. We shared small smiles, quiet laughs, the kind that arise not from humor alone but from the relief of understanding, of mutual recognition. I realized she was letting me in, revealing her humanity in a way that few ever saw. The tension that had simmered between us before became something more nuanced, a mixture of admiration, empathy, and a subtle, unspoken attraction. I became aware of the rhythm of her breathing, the soft tone of her voice, the faint scent she carried even in the emptiness of the office. By the time I returned to my desk, something had shifted permanently. She wasn't just my boss anymore, she was a person I wanted to understand, to support, to connect with beyond the professional boundaries that defined the rest of the office. The unspoken tension from before now had a new layer, one of care, empathy, and the quiet thrill of emotional closeness. For the first time, the slow-burn attraction between us felt human, grounded in something real, and infinitely more compelling than mere curiosity or flirtation. The office had emptied, leaving only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the muted tick of the clock against the walls. We were alone, finishing up a project that had taken longer than expected. The quiet felt different somehow, heavier yet intimate, like the space itself was holding its breath. She moved around her desk to help me with a last set of documents, and the proximity, so casual yet charged, made my chest tighten. As she leaned over the papers, her hand brushing mine just enough for me to notice, I became painfully aware of the warmth radiating from her. The gesture was fleeting, professional, yet there was a softness to it that lingered, making the air between us feel electric. Her eyes met mine briefly, holding a depth of unspoken words, and for a moment, it was as though the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of us suspended in a quiet, charged bubble. "You've been working hard," she said softly, her voice low and rich, carrying a sincerity that made my heart tighten. There was no teasing here, no playful ambiguity, just an acknowledgement, a quiet affirmation that felt heavier than any words of praise I had received before. I wanted to say something in return, to articulate the swirl of emotions stirring inside me, but my voice caught, leaving me aware of the fragile tension between us. We lingered there, leaning close over the papers, and in that shared silence, the room seemed to shrink. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, the subtle rhythm of her breathing, and the warmth of her presence brushing past me in the soft glow of the desk lamp. Every instinct screamed at me to close the distance, yet respect and hesitation held me back, forcing me to exist in that delicate space between longing and propriety. Then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out again, this time letting her fingers lightly brush my forearm in a gesture that was comforting and intimate all at once. It wasn't bold, it wasn't overstepping, it was a quiet confession, a subtle acknowledgement that she felt the same tension, the same unspoken connection. My pulse quickened, and a warmth spread through me, not just from attraction, but from the realization that we were both aware of the growing bond between us. By the time we finally returned to our desks, the night had deepened, and the office felt transformed. The slow-burn attraction, once defined by glances and brief touches, had deepened into a quiet, mutual recognition of desire and respect. The tension between us was no longer just about curiosity, it had become a shared, delicate intimacy, rich with possibilities, and tempered by the care we each felt for the other. The days following that late-night work session carried a subtle shift. The office rhythm felt lighter, more intimate, as though our previous moments had left an invisible mark. She began to acknowledge my efforts in ways that went beyond the usual professional nods. It was small gestures at first, a thoughtful word, a quiet smile as I completed a task, but each one carried a depth I hadn't anticipated. I realized that the reward she had hinted at weeks before wasn't something grand or showy, it was emotional, personal, and far more compelling. One afternoon, she called me over to her desk, and I noticed the softening of her posture, the gentle warmth in her eyes. She handed me a notebook she thought I'd like, the kind that felt personal, the paper smooth beneath my fingers. Her hand brushed mine as she passed it to me, brief, fleeting, yet electrifying in its subtlety. The warmth lingered, and I found myself holding it a second longer than necessary, acutely aware of the connection, however delicate, that existed in that simple touch. "You've been doing great work," she said, her voice calm yet layered with sincerity. It wasn't a compliment that could be casually dismissed, it was infused with attention and recognition, a quiet validation that made my chest tighten with unexpected pride. In that moment, the reward was not about recognition alone, it was about the unspoken intimacy embedded in her gestures, the shared understanding that our connection had grown beyond mere professional courtesy. The office seemed to contract around us, the usual clatter of keyboards and murmur of colleagues replaced by a quiet resonance between our two presences. Every glance, every subtle motion felt heightened, the tilt of her head as she offered guidance, the fleeting brush of her arm when reaching for the same document, the softness of her smile that lingered just a moment too long. Each small acknowledgement was layered with warmth, with an unspoken message that both of us were aware of the delicate tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of the week, I realized that this reward was something more profound than I had anticipated. It was trust, attention, and care, wrapped in gestures so subtle they could be mistaken for casual interactions, yet heavy with emotional resonance. She was showing me, without words, that she valued not only my work but also the person I was becoming in her presence. The slow-burn tension that had started with glances and whispers had matured into something deeper, mutual respect, quiet affection, and the thrill of shared understanding. In that space, I felt the invisible bridge between us strengthen. The age gap, the professional boundaries, all the subtle hesitations, they mattered less than the undeniable connection forming in the quiet gestures, the thoughtful smiles, and the small, deliberate moments that whispered of trust, care, and something neither of us could yet name aloud. The tension that had simmered for weeks finally found a gentle release one quiet afternoon outside the office. We met for coffee, ostensibly to discuss a minor project, but the mood was entirely different from the polished professionalism of the workplace. The sunlight filtered softly through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow across the table, and I noticed the subtle way she adjusted her posture, relaxed in a way she rarely allowed herself in the office. The conversation began casually, brushing over reports and deadlines, but slowly it shifted. We laughed quietly over shared observations, the kind of laughter that comes from genuine connection rather than surface amusement. Every so often, our hands would brush over the edge of the table, brief, accidental touches that lingered just enough to make my pulse quicken. It was no longer a matter of unspoken tension, it was mutual awareness, a shared acknowledgement of the bond that had quietly grown between us. Her eyes caught mine often, but without the teasing ambiguity of the office whispers. There was warmth there now, depth, and a softness that made the entire moment feel suspended in time. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm authority, but also a vulnerability that invited honesty. I found myself drawn to her, not merely by curiosity or desire, but by the steady confidence and quiet kindness that radiated from her presence. At one point, she reached across the table, lightly resting her hand near mine. It wasn't a bold or provocative gesture, it was a gentle, grounding touch, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her care. The warmth of her palm against the back of my hand, the subtle pressure, was enough to make the space between us feel intimate without ever crossing a line. It was, in its simplicity, a reward far richer than words or grand gestures could convey. We walked together afterward, the air crisp but softened by the late afternoon sun. Side by side, our shoulders brushed occasionally, small, natural gestures that spoke of familiarity, comfort, and trust. For the first time, I felt entirely at ease with her, not just in her presence, but in the emotional honesty we now shared. The age gap that had once felt like a quiet tension had become irrelevant, what mattered was the connection, the steady warmth that existed in the space between us. By the end of the day, I realized the slow-burn attraction had evolved into something deeper, a mutual respect, trust, and care that formed the foundation for a genuine, age-gap romance. There were no rushed declarations or melodrama, just two people, quietly aware of each other, discovering that closeness and affection could exist within the rhythms of everyday life. The story didn't need a dramatic flourish to feel complete, it was complete in the smiles, the soft touches, and the unspoken understanding that what had begun as subtle tension had blossomed into lasting, meaningful connection. If this slow-burn romance left your heart racing, don't miss the full story. Click the link in the description to watch the complete journey of their connection.